Welcome back to the IBFP. Here's your host, Foxy New.
Fanboys, be advised, this video contains the absolute truth, may cause hurt feelings, and the need to thumbs down the video. Man down. Errol Spence Jr. is interested in a CANELO Alvarez fight. Look, let's just break it down honestly and objectively as possible. Errol Spence Jr. did, an interview with The Sun where he came out and, stated that he'd be interested and excited to face CANELO Alvarez in front of 80,000 people in Texas Stadium once the pandemic has subsided a little bit, to allow all the crowds back into the stadiums. Some of his direct quotes were, with CANELO Alvarez, I definitely entertain that fight. That fight can happen. That's a huge fight. That would be huge for the Cowboys Stadium when we're back to 100% capacity. It's another mega fight which I could have, and I could have a lot of mega fights. He also goes on to state, it takes quite a few pounds to get down to 147 pounds, so I wouldn't have any problems fighting CANELO Alvarez at 160 pounds. So that's a weight that Errol Spence Jr. would be open to, but at the end of the day, it's down to the guys in the suits. So, when you look at it, CANELO Alvarez and Eddie Reynoso has already spoken, in the past that CANELO Alvarez is going to be fighting at 168 pounds and even at 160. So those are the two weight classes CANELO Alvarez is going to continue to toggle from, fight in, and those were the best fights for him. So the fact that Errol Spence is mentioning CANELO Alvarez at 160 is a possible fight for CANELO. Obviously not next, but it's obviously a fight that could have potential of happening. But the problem I have is Errol Spence Jr. is delusional about the fight. And what I mean by that is, CANELO Alvarez is on a streak of facing back-to-back champions and looking at facing another champion. Errol Spence has nothing to offer at 160 pounds for CANELO Alvarez. In addition to that, Errol Spence Jr. doesn't have the skill set or the talent or power to even compete with CANELO Alvarez. That's a tune-up fight for CANELO Alvarez. Even if you want to call it that, it's a very easy fight for CANELO. And let me explain to you why. Errol Spence Jr.'s best win of his career was against Kell Brook, who was coming off of a knockout loss, an eye injury, and down 2 weight classes, which means he was weight drained. He gets too much credit for these things, and he was losing, within the first 6 rounds to Kell Brook before the eye injury. You even seen Errol Spence Jr. when he fought Mikey Garcia. This is a Mikey Garcia coming up 2 weight classes where Errol Spence Jr. had a height and reach advantage, and this guy turns around and couldn't even stop him, couldn't even drop him. That's inexcusable for a guy who's supposed to be one of the strongest fighters in the division. Mikey Garcia was trying to initiate contact. Errol Spence was fighting defensive, and then when he unloaded on Mikey Garcia, he simply couldn't even hurt him. That's garbage truck juice. If you can't hurt Mikey Garcia, you don't have a chance in hell at hurting a guy like CANELO Alvarez who has an iron granite chin. I mean, when you face a small guy, you're not supposed to just dominate him. You're supposed to stop him. Let's be honest. And then, you've already seen that Shawn Porter arguably beat Errol Spence Jr. in his last fight. And the problem with that is a lot of people act like, it wasn't a robbery when it was. Even Shawn Porter contested, he won the fight. He arguably dominated the first 6 rounds. And even Keith Thurman, Danny Garcia, all these guys were ringside for the fight, and they were saying Shawn Porter is clearly outclassing Errol Spence within the first half of the fight. You've never seen Errol Spence dominated in the first half of a fight like you did against Shawn Porter. So whether you believe he won the second half and it was just a close fight, regardless, he did get dominated for at least 6 rounds in a fight. That's garbage truck juice with the guy the level of Shawn Porter. And he's a good quality fighter, but he's far from elite pound for pound. And not only that, you also see Errol Spence Jr. has been ducking and avoiding the best fighter at 147 in Terrence Bud Crawford. This is the same Errol Spence who told Terrence Crawford over 3 years ago, get a belt and we can make that fight happen. Since then, Terrence Crawford got a belt, but Mikey Garcia didn't have to get a belt, and he made that fight happen. Danny Garcia was planning a fight with Errol Spence Jr. before Errol Spence Jr. got into the car accident, and they were making that fight happen even without a belt. So at the end of the day, it's obvious Errol Spence Jr. wants no part of Terrence Crawford while he's still showing signs that he's a top pound for pound fighter. He's looking for a decline in Terrence Crawford before he's willing to take that fight. And what fight does he have lined up next should he be successful with Danny Garcia? Al Heyman has told Shawn Porter that he would be facing the winner of Errol Spence, Danny Garcia. So at the end of the day, you see that Errol Spence Jr. is still not looking in Terrence Crawford's direction. On the other hand, when you look at a guy like Saul Canelo Alvarez, this guy is, going up in weight, facing and beating a guy at light heavyweight in a Sergey Kovalev. This is a Canelo Alvarez that's shown that he can battle elite fighters like Gennady Golovkin, Sergey Kovalev. The guy beat Danny Jacobs. Let's just be honest about the situation. Canelo Alvarez is levels above Errol Spence Jr., and he's far from a Mikey Garcia. He has elite level skills, power. He fights in a higher weight class, has a granite chin, and this is a guy who hasn't lost in the last 12 fights since he fought Floyd Mayweather at 23 years old. We got to be honest about it. And when you break down the fight between Canelo and Errol Spence, you see that Errol Spence said he felt Shawn Porter's power. He felt his power. And there was a few points where you saw Errol Spence moved visibly by Shawn Porter's power. And Shawn Porter's not a big power puncher. He's not known as a knockout power guy in the division of the welterweight. But if you think that you felt his power, imagine what you would feel with a guy like Canelo Alvarez. Imagine the type of power and shots you would take facing a guy like this at this level with that type of power. I mean, think about it like this. This same Errol Spence who said, "I don't believe anybody that has the power to knock me out." So he doesn't see anybody knocking him out. If he feels he loses, it has to be on a decision. And that's where he's delusional. Canelo Alvarez easily breaks him down and stops him. He simply doesn't have the skills required to compete at the level of a Canelo Alvarez. I don't even believe Errol Spence can compete at 160 pounds, much less at 154 against even Charlo. I mean, at the end of the day, his defense, his skill set is just not at the top level. The only guy he's ever thoroughly dominated and won every round was against a guy like Mikey Garcia moving up 2 weight classes. No true welterweight at the top level has he dominated completely. Shawn Porter, he went life and death with this man. And not only that, a lot of people forget that Errol Spence Jr. was rocked out of his shoes by Latterdy in the Latterdy fight. At the end of the day, he's easy work for Canelo Alvarez, and he should slap himself for even mentioning this as a possible fight. But once again, Unbiased as always, it's the IBFP.